Betrayal by my sister, how my own parents took my business away from me. The Colden child effect. Growing up in a small suburban neighborhood, I was the kind of kid who understood the basics. Soap was for washing, towels were for drying, and the toilet was for, well, you know. My childhood was filled with simple, logical truths like these. There was no room for complexity, no hidden rules that turned mundane objects into artifacts too sacred to touch. At home, my mom was practical. Our soap was the standard bar of Ivory or Dove, nothing fancy. Our towels were plain, usually a bit worn from constant use. And in my world, soap was always meant for scrubbing. Towels were for drying, and that was that. I'd never come across the concept of decorative anything, let alone soap or towels. I had no idea that these seemingly ordinary household items could serve any purpose other than the obvious. Then, one fateful day when I was 9, I went to my friend Danny's house to hang out. Danny was the cool kid in the neighborhood, the one with the latest video games, a trampoline in the backyard, and a seemingly endless supply of snacks. His house was like a paradise for a kid like me. It was a world of new experiences, where every corner of his house seemed to offer something exciting or unknown. After a few rounds of jumping on the trampoline, we decided to head inside and play some Monopoly. As we started setting up the board, I excused myself to use the bathroom. I walked down the hallway and entered what I assumed was just an ordinary bathroom. But this was Danny's mom's bathroom, and she was no ordinary mom. The bathroom was pristine, almost unnervingly so. The walls were painted a soft lavender, and the room smelled faintly of lavender too, which I assumed was just good air freshener. Little did I know I was in the realm of what I would soon come to recognize as decorative hell. I washed my hands, as any decent human being does, and reached for the soap. That's when I saw them. Tiny, seashell-shaped soaps arranged delicately on a porcelain dish. They were pastel-colored, with intricate little designs, and they looked fancy, almost too fancy for a bathroom. But I didn't think twice. I grabbed a seashell-shaped soap, lathered it up, and marveled at how soft and nice it felt. Fancy soap is fancy soap, right? Might as well enjoy it. I finished up, dried my hands on the plush towels that were neatly folded on the rack, and went back to join Danny in the rec room. Monopoly was in full swing, and I was happily plotting how to bankrupt him when we heard it, the scream. "Who used my soap?" The shrill accusatory voice echoed through the house like a banshee wailing in the night. Danny and I exchanged wide-eyed looks, both of us frozen in place, game pieces in hand. Then we heard the thunderous footsteps as his mom, Mrs. Benito, came storming down the stairs like a fury unleashed. Clutched in her hand were the delicate, now slightly damp seashell soaps. Her eyes were wild, and she was seething with rage. "Which one of you little bastards used my decorative soaps?" she shrieked, her voice quivering with anger. I was in shock. I had never seen an adult so enraged over something so trivial. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the situation. Was this some kind of joke? Had I just broken some ancient unspoken rule? When no one else spoke up, I knew it was up to me to confess. Meekly, I raised my hand, like a kid who'd just been caught sneaking a cookie before dinner. "I did," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Was I wrong?" Her eyes narrowed, and she fixed me with a glare that could have turned me to stone. "You ignorant little shit," she spat, her voice dripping with disdain. "Those soaps are for decoration only. What kind of idiot doesn't know that?" My heart sank as I tried to explain myself. "I didn't know. I've never seen soap that you're not supposed to use." But she wasn't listening. She was too busy muttering about how my mother must have raised me wrong, how I was a terrible kid, and how dare I ruin her precious soaps. Then she stormed back upstairs, still muttering under her breath. I stood there, utterly mortified. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting of tears threatening to spill over. I wasn't just embarrassed. I was furious. Furious at her for overreacting. Furious at the world for having something as stupid as decorative soap. And furious at myself for getting into this mess. Danny, bless his heart, tried to comfort me. He apologized for his mom's outburst and told me that she was crazy about her decorative soaps and towels. He even admitted that he was supposed to warn me, but forgot. His apology made me feel a little better, but the damage was done. As we sat back down to continue our game, Danny started listing other things his mom was nuts about. Apparently, the soap and towels were just the tip of the iceberg. He told me about how she raked the carpet in the living room to keep the shag looking perfect, and how she freaked out if anyone left footprints in it. But the thing she loved most, he said, was her garden. She was obsessed with it, spending hours tending to her plants and flowers, and bragging to anyone who would listen about how beautiful it was. The more Danny talked, the angrier I got. Who did this woman think she was, treating me like that over something so ridiculous? I was just a kid who didn't know any better, but instead of trying to understand, she had humiliated me, making me feel like the lowest of the low. By the time I left Danny's house that day, I had made up my mind. I was going to get revenge on Mrs. Benito, but I wasn't just going to prank her. I was going to hit her where it hurt the most. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and in my case, it was about to be served steaming hot, straight from a dog's backside. It took me about a week to get my plan in motion. During that time, I didn't tell anyone what I was up to, not even Danny. This was my mission, and I was going to carry it out solo. You see, one of my chores at home was cleaning up after our dog, Max. Max was a big boxer with an even bigger appetite, and what goes in must come out. Every day, I would go into the backyard with a plastic bag and scoop up the considerable piles of poo that Max had so generously deposited. It was a dirty job, but it had to be done. But this time, instead of throwing the bagged poo into the trash, I started hiding it behind our shed. My mom never went back there, so I knew it would be safe. Every day, I added more to the collection, letting it accumulate until I had a sizable stash of dog shit. It was disgusting, but I was fueled by righteous anger. Mrs. Benito had humiliated me, and I was going to give her a taste of her own medicine. Finally, after a week of gathering, I decided it was time to strike. I waited until late at night when the whole neighborhood was asleep, and I snuck out of the house with my bag of collected dog poop in hand. The darkness made the task even more thrilling, like I was some sort of ninja on a covert mission. Danny's house was just a few blocks away, and I knew that his mom's prized garden was right out front, on full display for everyone to see. It was her pride and joy, the thing she loved more than anything else in the world, and I was about to turn it into a minefield of dog crap. I crept into their yard, my heart pounding in my chest as I surveyed the garden. Even in the dim moonlight, I could see the neat rows of flowers, the carefully trimmed bushes, and the perfectly manicured lawn. It was immaculate, just like everything else in her house. But not for long. I started by spreading the dog poop around the base of the flowers, making sure to get some in the middle of the bushes, where it would be harder to spot. Then, I moved onto the lawn, strategically placing little mounds of poo in the grass, where she would step on them without noticing until it was too late. I even got creative and lined some along the windowsill, so when you looked out, it looked like a shitty version of an Easter egg hunt gone wrong. By the time I was done, the garden was a disaster zone. It reeked of dog crap, and I could only imagine the horror that Mrs. Benito would feel when she saw what had happened to her beloved plants. As I snuck back home, a sense of satisfaction washed over me. This was justice. This was payback for the humiliation and embarrassment she had caused me. I felt like a hero, standing up for every kid who had ever been unfairly yelled at by an unreasonable adult. The next morning, I eagerly awaited the news. I knew it wouldn't be long before word spread about the disaster in Mrs. Benito's garden. And sure enough, later that day, I overheard my mom talking on the phone with a neighbor. "Oh my God, did you hear what happened to the Benito's garden?" she said, her voice a mix of shock and amusement. "Someone covered the entire thing in dog poop. Can you believe that?" I could barely contain my glee as I listened to the conversation. It was even better than I had imagined. The whole neighborhood was talking about it, and I knew that Mrs. Benito was beside herself with rage. She probably thought it was some random act of vandalism, never suspecting that it was the work of a kid she had wronged. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but smile every time I walked past Danny's house. I could see her out there, desperately trying to clean up the mess, her face twisted in frustration. The garden was ruined, and no matter how hard she tried, the smell lingered, a constant reminder of what had happened. Danny never mentioned the incident, and I didn't bring it up. I figured it was better that way, less chance of anyone figuring out that I was behind it. But every time I saw him, I couldn't help but feel a little proud of myself. I had stood up to the bully, and I had won. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal. The garden incident eventually faded from the neighborhood gossip, and things at Danny's house seemed to calm down. Mrs. Benito was still as particular as ever, but she seemed to have mellowed out a bit, probably still traumatized by the Great Garden Poopocalypse. I thought the whole thing was behind me. I had gotten my revenge, and it felt good. But then something unexpected happened. One day after school, Danny invited me over to his house to play video games. I hesitated at first, still a little wary of his mom, but Danny assured me that she was in a much better mood these days. So I agreed. When we got to his house, I was surprised to find Mrs. Benito in the kitchen, baking cookies. She looked up when we walked in and smiled, an actual, genuine smile. It was a little unnerving, to be honest. This was the same woman who had gone ballistic over decorative soap just a few weeks earlier. "Hi there," she said warmly. "Would you boys like some cookies? They're fresh out of the oven." Danny and I exchanged a look of disbelief. Who was this woman? And what had she done with Angry Mom? Sure, thanks," I replied cautiously, still not sure if this was some kind of trap. She handed us each a cookie, and we sat down at the kitchen table to eat them. To my surprise, they were delicious. Soft, gooey, and chocolatey, just the way I liked them. As we sat there, munching on cookies, Mrs. Benito turned to me and said something that nearly made me choke on my cookie. "You know, I've been meaning to apologize to you," she said, her tone sincere. "I realized that I overreacted the other day when you used the soap. It was just soap, after all, and I shouldn't have yelled at you like that." I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. Was this really happening? Was she actually apologizing to me? "I didn't mean to make you feel bad," she continued. "I was just having a rough day, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry." I didn't know what to say. This was the last thing I had expected. For a moment I felt a pang of guilt for what I had done to her garden. Maybe I had gone too far. Maybe I should have just let it go. But then I remembered how humiliated I had felt, and the guilt quickly faded. "It's okay," I mumbled, unsure of what else to say. She smiled again, and I couldn't help but notice that she seemed different, more relaxed, less high-strung. Maybe the garden incident had humbled her a bit, made her realize that there were more important things in life than decorative soap and perfectly manicured lawns. After that day, things were different. Danny's mom was still particular about her house, but she wasn't as intense as she used to be. She even started inviting me over more often, offering us snacks and chatting with us like a normal mom. It was weird, but in a good way. One day, while we were playing video games, Danny turned to me and said, "You know, I think my mom is actually kind of cool now." I laughed, shaking my head in disbelief. "Yeah, I guess she is." And that's when I realized that maybe, just maybe, people could change. Even someone as crazy as Mrs. Benito. Just as I was getting used to the new, improved Mrs. Benito, life threw me another curveball. It happened on a sunny Saturday morning when I was out in the front yard playing catch with Max. My mom came outside, holding the phone with a strange look on her face. "It's for you," she said, handing me the receiver. I took the phone, curious about who could be calling me. "Hello?" "Hey, it's Danny," came the voice on the other end. "You'll never guess what happened." "What?" "You know how my mom's been all chill lately? Well, I think I know why. We found out that the garden incident was actually a blessing in disguise." I blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Danny's voice was filled with excitement as he explained. So, after the poopocalypse, my mom was so upset that she decided to get rid of the old plants and flowers and start fresh. She spent weeks researching and finally decided to plant a new garden with these rare, exotic flowers that she'd always wanted to try. Okay, I said, not sure where this was going. Well, it turns out that these new flowers are like super valuable. Some gardening magazine featured them, and now people are offering my mom a ton of money for them. She's actually thinking about starting a side business selling these rare flowers. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The very thing I had done to get back at her had somehow led to her finding a new passion and a potential business opportunity. So, you're telling me that because of the dog poop, your mom is now making money from her garden? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around it. Pretty much, Danny replied with a laugh. It's crazy, right? But the best part is that she's been way more relaxed and happy ever since. It's like she's a totally different person. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. My act of revenge had backfired in the most unexpected way possible. Instead of ruining her garden, I had inadvertently helped her find a new passion and a way to make money. It was poetic, really, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. Man, that's wild, I said, shaking my head. Who would have thought? Yeah, it's pretty cool, Danny said. Anyway, I just thought you want to know. Maybe we can come over to your place later and hang out. Sounds good, I replied, still chuckling at the absurdity of it all. See you later. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile. Life had a funny way of surprising you, and this was one surprise I hadn't seen coming. I had set out to teach Mrs. Benito a lesson, and in the end, I had learned one myself. Revenge, as it turns out, is a dish best served with a side of irony. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The incident with the decorative soap, the poop-filled garden, and the unexpected twist that had turned my act of revenge into something positive. It was like something out of a movie. A comedy, of course. I realized that maybe I had been too quick to seek revenge. Maybe, instead of retaliating, I could have just let it go. But then again, if I hadn't taken action, things might never have changed. Mrs. Benito might still be the same high-strung, obsessive woman she had always been, and I might still be harboring resentment. But life had a way of working things out, and in the end, everything had turned out for the best. Danny and I were closer than ever, and his mom had found a new passion that brought her joy and fulfillment. And as for me, I had learned a valuable lesson about forgiveness, change, and the unexpected consequences of our actions. One afternoon, as I was walking past Danny's house, I saw Mrs. Benito in the garden, tending to her new exotic flowers. She looked up and saw me, and instead of glaring or scolding me, she waved and smiled. "Hey there," she called out cheerfully. "Come take a look at these beauties." I walked over, curious to see what she had planted. The garden was filled with vibrant colors and unusual plants that I had never seen before. It was stunning, and I couldn't help but admire the work she had put into it. "They're amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "Thank you," she replied, beaming with pride. "It's funny how things work out sometimes, isn't it?" "Yeah," I agreed, smiling to myself. "It really is." As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure. The tension, the anger, the desire for revenge. It was all gone. In its place was a newfound respect for the power of change and the importance of moving forward. From that day on, I made a promise to myself to let go of grudges, to focus on the positive, and to embrace the unexpected twists and turns that life had to offer. After all, you never know when something seemingly terrible might turn into something wonderful. And who knows? Maybe one day, I'd even find myself using decorative soap again, this time with a smile on my face and a story to tell. Epilogue, the moral of the story. Years later, as I look back on that time, I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. What started as a simple misunderstanding over decorative soap turned into a life lesson that I'll never forget. Sometimes, the things that anger us the most can lead to the greatest growth. Sometimes revenge can backfire in ways we never expected. And sometimes the people who seem the most unreasonable can surprise us with their capacity for change. In the end, it's not about the soap or the garden. It's about the people, the relationships, and the lessons we learn along the way. And as for me, I've learned to appreciate the beauty in the unexpected, the humor in life's little twists, and the value of letting go. After all, life is too short to hold on to grudges, especially when there's so much to be gained from moving forward. So, here's to forgiveness, to change, and to the power of a little dog poop to turn the world upside down in the best way possible.